Hello and welcome to another edition of ISG Smartalks, the podcast where we try to educate, inspire and entertain our listeners on how digital technology is transforming business in all of its various forms. This is our final episode of 2019. It's going to be a bit of a retrospective on the 9 episodes we've had so far this year and the 16 guests that I've interviewed. We are joined today by 2 more guests, and I will get my guests to introduce themselves in a second. But before I do, let me just remind you of the episodes that we've had so far this year. We kicked off this series with an episode on digital sourcing and how the world of sourcing is being transformed by digital technology. That was with Steve Hall and myself. We then had an episode on the legal world of contracting with digital technology and outsourcing and how that's changed. And I was joined by Kit Burden from DLA Piper. We then had an episode on the future of work, again with Steve Hall, who's a real expert in this area. We then talked about the rise of AI with Mark Kelly from AI Ireland. We then talked about service orchestration in episode 5 with Kit Cox, who's the CEO of Innate. We followed that with an episode on networks and 5G and the whole future of networking technology with Phil Hugus and John Harrod. We then talked about ISG index data on the world of sourcing and how ISG have been tracking the changing dynamics of the sourcing industry over the last 70 consecutive quarters with Stanton Jones. We then had an episode live from the Automation Summit in London, where I talked to 4 different guests about their various differing perspectives on the world of automation. And then finally, we had an episode on blockchain, where I was joined by Alex Manders and Mandeep Shan from Wipro, and we talked about blockchain and distributed ledger technology and my mum. So we've had quite a diverse range of topics for 2019. We've made a successful start to our podcast, and we have big plans for a new series on what it takes to be a leader in the digital world for 2020. But before we wave goodbye to 2019, we're going to take a little look back on some of the topics we've talked about and the 5 questions that I always ask our guests. And I'll go through those in a second. But first, let me introduce you to our guests. So first, I should say ladies first, because I have a lady and a gentleman sitting next to me. And the lady I know pretty well. So Eleanor Matthews. Eleanor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Eleanor Matthews. I have worked in and around sourcing pretty much forever, both provider side and as an advisor. I'm particularly interested in the way that digital is changing sourcing, but I'm also very interested in all the various topics that come up as a result of this podcast. So looking forward to this.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm also joined by Bryn Barlow. Mr. Barlow.
Good morning, everybody. I run the financial services practice for ISG. I've been doing that for about 3.5 years now, and I guess I've been involved in technology and business for well over 25 years now. It didn't start that way. I kicked off my career as a rugby player back in the 90s when fat, slow people were allowed to play sport at a decent level. And then I started a career running technology practices for British American Tobacco and Diageo before enjoying the dot-com boom around the turn of the century and working for myself for a few years.
Excellent, thank you. And pleasure to have you both with me today. So as you know, every time we have a guest on this podcast, we ask them 5 specific questions, and it's been a really interesting exercise. I came up with these 5 questions thinking there was a bit of a mixture of personal and in sort of human nature, if you like, but also technology and predictions for the future. So the first question I've asked all of our 16 guests so far is, which technology has had the biggest impact on your career to date, or on their career to date? And why? And I think let's start with that question, as it's the first one on the list. And I think it's an interesting question because it's not necessarily a technology that's had the biggest impact on society or an impact on business. It's the technology that's had the biggest impact on their particular lives. So before we dive into what our previous guests have said on the podcasts, let me ask that question to both of you guys, and then we'll take it from there and see what other people said as well. So, Eleanor, let me turn to you first. Is there a technology that's had a really big influence on your life to date, or on your career to date, and if so, why?
Yes, so I would say the technology that I would point at is remote working in all its guises. 100 years ago, when I started my career, I was working in technical support, which people who know me may be surprised by. And what that involved, I lived in Winchester, and I was looking after a technology for a telecoms company based in Reading. And what it meant was at 2:00 in the morning, a server would go down. I would get a bleep on my pager. I would get in the car. I would drive to Reading, and I would press buttons until it stopped flashing red. And then suddenly someone said, here's a laptop. That means you can do all of that pressing buttons from the comfort of your own kitchen with a coffee in your hand. And that kind of changed everything. And if you look at everything I've done since then, although I'm very far from technical support now, I do work with a lot of different clients who are in lots of different locations. And even within those projects, you've got people dispersed all over the world. And we're able to do business in an entirely different way, thanks to that family of technologies.
Yeah, really good answer. It has made a real difference, that, isn't it? It's enabled us all to be so flexible. The fact that you can log in from anywhere to do anything and don't have to be physically next to the device. Mr. Barlow, what about you?
Well, I can say the internet changed my life. Professionally, definitely. Personally, certainly. And even as a father and a parent and a connected spouse, it's made my life very, very different. So I can remember when I set up shop as head of IT at Guinness in the UK, the world was very introspective. We were talking about SAP R2 as something really exciting and, really unleashing the power of Lotus Notes on the world. And then almost overnight, the world changed. Yeah. And it changed for me in every dimension. I left the corporate world and I set up a .com startup and an online internet retailer.
Did you? I didn't even know that.
Absolutely profound. A completely different way of working, a completely different way of engaging with consumers, and it helped me think very differently about what technology can do. And secondly, when I'm away and I'm travelling and I want to speak to the kids or I want to speak to Nicola, I can do that so easily. Whereas before, I was pretty much a hostage to travel. So for me, it's been a fundamental change.
I think it's been an interesting question to ask, as I said, because it's been that mixture of personal and business. In the first episode where we talked about digital sourcing, and we asked Steve Hall, who runs ISG Europe, and he also runs all the digital services at ISG globally, he mentioned that his the technology that had the biggest impact on his career to date was the Kindle, which was interesting, right? Not necessarily what you'd expect, but like a lot of successful leaders, they read a lot of books. There's some statistic that says a successful chief exec reads 5 books a week, or something like
Steve's
that.
Going to be ahead of the game, I think.
And I don't know how many Steve said he reads.
11.
I mean, amazing. But he also said I think he travels 300,000 miles a year or something. I don't know how you work how many miles you travel, or when you have the time, if you're reading so much, to actually look at the distance you travelled on a plane. But he definitely travels a lot. And a Kindle has sort of changed his life because he could take all of those books with him. We watched this documentary recently about Bill Gates from Microsoft and how he spends a week every year of his life just locked up in this log cabin with these boxes of books. And you think how quaint and old-fashioned now, as soon as the Kindle came along there, right? Because you just walk along with this tiny little tablet and you've got thousands of books because you're connected to the internet. I think that was a good answer.
The other thing with that is that it just shows that digital does not always mean connected. So you can use your Kindle up a mountain in darkest Tibet and you're still having a digital experience without necessarily being connected to the rest of the world. Yeah. So it's not all about being connected.
Yeah. You can't read on the sunbed, though. Always been a bit of a problem with the Kindle.
Yeah.
I think that the story that resonated most for me was when Kim was talking about the BBC Micros. And my dad was a head teacher and he brought to life quite well, I thought, the contribution the BBC were making and how they rolled those out across all. And that was unveiled magically at our house. I remember that really, really clearly.
Yeah. Well, I found that episode interesting when this is Kit Cox, who's the chief exec of Innate. He said it was the BBC Micro. And I hadn't realised that the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, had actually sponsored that initiative. I just thought when I was 10 or whatever, when that happened, that the BBC Micro was just a brand like the ZX Spectrum or the Commodore 64 at the time.
Kit said it switched him onto coding. It turned me off because I remember subscribing to this magazine you get every 2 weeks. It had a little program that you could type out and effectively try and get your name printing across the screen routinely. But it always had a bug in it. You had to wait 2 weeks for the updates for the damn thing to come through so it would be working.
But what I also loved about that is that whole story is about the democratization of technology and information. And if you look at all the things that people have said, that's kind of a theme that runs through everything. So blockchain's about democratization of control, and blogging is about allowing anyone to publish anything at any time. TCP/IP, it enables all of that. Without the internet, you couldn't sit in a mountain cabin in Tibet writing a blog about your Kindle. That just wouldn't happen.
Exactly.
But I think the best told story I thought went to the other Kit Burden. I thought he brought to life beautifully how email changed the game for him as a lawyer, how it changed how he could interact with his clients, how it changed his business processes, how it changed how he related to just about everybody. But most importantly, seemed to speed up life and made everything more immediate. That was a really interesting balance.
Yeah, it sort of put... and Kit Burden's a partner at DLA Piper, so worked at the legal profession all of his life. He said it really brought the relationship between client and lawyer much closer together because you had nobody as an intermediary in between you, providing you with information from the client. The client could get hold of you immediately, and you didn't have to dictate. Remember, they would always dictate into those devices, and then someone would type it in a typing pool, and then send it off. And suddenly, email meant that you had this direct relationship. And when you think about it, and I think I said this at the time that email's been around 30 years at a push, maybe from high 20s, maybe, but it's only really been prevalent in industry for the last 25 years or so. And now, we spend an inordinate amount of time responding to email. And as I think I said in the podcast, the younger generation don't. And so when they're coming into the workforce, they're really not used to spending all their time sitting in front of Microsoft Outlook or, like as we do. And they've got this whole weird world of connecting through what is a very old-fashioned application for them when they could be using these direct chat apps, which although we all use in our company, but we still also duplicate by sending an email just to back it up right now.
I did notice that Kit didn't say if it was for good or for bad.
Yeah. And then Stanton Jones, who's a researcher and analyst, said blogging, which of course for somebody in Stanton's role makes perfect sense. You suddenly, you don't have to publish a book necessarily. You suddenly, from the comfort of your own home, you can get your perspective out there to the market with video and text and interviews or podcast or whatever. And as you said, it just using technology for democratization, which I thought was really interesting.
I enjoyed the Hughes and Harrod combination. I think they got closest to my preference for the internet when they were talking about that, the internet protocol and the development of what went before the web back in those dark days of the early 80s and ARPANET and all the rest of it.
That's right, yeah.
But when you reflect on that and you think forward, I think it's still the case that only 60% of the world is connected, even after the 30, 40 years that this technology's been going.
Wow.
We still have 3 billion people more to come online and bring all their connections with them. When you think about how that's going to help with financial inclusion, educational inclusion, and hopefully a richer connectedness, I think it's real food for thought.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I listened to a podcast the other day, actually, where I found out that only a small percentage of what goes on the internet is actually on the public internet that we see. And if you think about the dark web, and I don't even have a clue how you would access the dark web, there's so much more going on there than we see in our daily lives on the normal web. And it's like this vast array. But if you say there's that percentage of the population who still don't access it,
it's mind-boggling.
It really is, isn't it? So, okay. So that's the first question, which was what technology had the biggest impact on your career. Some interesting responses. The next question I've asked all of our guests so far is there a technology which, in your opinion, has been a bit of a damp squib, which has promised a lot but delivered very little? And there were some really interesting answers here, actually, and some commonality. But before we talk about everybody else's answers throughout the series, let me ask you two which technology fits that description for you. So let me start with Mr. Barlow this time. So, Bryn, is there a technology that you think's been a damp squib?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little difficult coming after 9 other people with a strong opinion. I can say yes, all of the above. But I think if there was one that didn't feature on the list that I'd add to it, it'd definitely be wearables. I can remember quite clearly all the hype around things like Google Glass and how that was going to change the world for the better and make our lives richer. But really all it ended up doing was creating another category of person, which, if I remember right, were glass holes.
I take that personally because I, of course, bought some straight away. Excellent. What about you, Eleanor?
So for me, it's a simpler thing. It's like a consumer thing. I remember being so excited about 3D TV. We had small kids at the time, and I thought this is going to be marvellous. And actually, what possessed anyone to make them believe that people would sit on their own sofa wearing the silly glasses you're forced to wear in the cinema, watching the television? This was never going to work.
It's such a headache.
Yeah, exactly. There's been some interesting ones. Now, one of the themes that came out of the responses from other guests was a bit of a surprise to me, actually, which was blockchain. So quite a few people, I don't know how many out of the 16 said, but probably half said that one of the technologies that they felt was most overhyped and underdelivered was blockchain. And I wonder whether that's, and I should say to our listeners that I'm sitting between two experts in the field. Both have been studied at Oxford University and their blockchain qualification. So they really will have an expert view on this rather than my generalist view. But I'm wondering whether it's just a little bit ahead of its time and that with a few more years it will reach maturity and be hugely disruptive. But there's obviously a lot of people out there who think, well, actually, it's a solution looking for a problem.
Yeah. I think it's got a bit of it's been treated harshly, is what I'd say. If I take my market perspective on it, talk about what's going on in the world of banking and insurance, just thinking about it, the technology's been around for over 10 years. So I don't think it's sort of ahead of its time at all. I think the first 6 or 7 years was a massive distraction around cryptocurrency. And you alluded to the dark web. I think there's all sorts of under the covers activity going on that really took the technology and its adoption down the wrong path. Only in the last couple of years has we've seen the DLT adoption start to push into mainstream business. In my market, in the last 12 months, banks alone have spent $500 million on various blockchain implementation activities. So it's really starting to push into the real world.
Yeah.
Perhaps naturally it's going to take that amount of time. If you think that in FS terms, we're trying to replace effectively trusted institutions with a sense of trust from a hidden online digital capability. It's going to take an awfully long time for people, for regulators, for clients and transmitters of financial transactions to get their head around that.
Yeah. Exactly. And if you think about the people who do not trust the banks are the people who hide their money under the mattress. They're not going to trust an unknown, faceless network of computer geeks.
Yeah, so certainly not in the context of a load of negative press about investments that have not perhaps gone the right way. So inevitably, I think it's taking an awful long time. But we're talking about, as with always, with all these things around technology, it's not about the technology. It's about changing human behaviour. It's about changing attitudes and getting society to adopt a different way of thinking. That's going to take an awfully long time.
Yeah. I thought Kit Burden gave a good response, and we had an interesting conversation about video call, and it's quite ironic actually when you think about the three of us have just spent the last 20 minutes trying to get something to display just on a big television on the wall in this room that we're sitting in. But the prospect of video calls back in the day, like 20 years ago, we thought it was going to be so simple that you could just press a button, automatically be able to have global video conference calls projected onto the wall, and that's still a pain even now with the application which we use on a daily basis. We still have lags where you can't see people. The child walks into the room, as it did with the BBC interview earlier this year, which is hilarious. But it's mainly the technology lets us down rather than you're just in the wrong place or wearing the wrong clothes. Yeah. I thought that was a really good one. And then a couple of people said virtual reality and VR and AR, and they thought that was going to be absolutely huge, but that hasn't really yet found a good use case for business.
Yeah, I saw a really big tech survey looking back on 2019 and sort of executive view on what's worked and what has not. And actually the sort of number one hated technology in terms of this overhyped, under-delivered is the virtual reality space. It's just not happened. It's not delivered. It's not found its business feet. And that said, I think, as the price of the technology and the price of screens and personal viewing capabilities comes down rapidly, perhaps we'll see that grow faster and faster. Yeah. But it's universally hated.
Yeah. And another one that came up a few times was RPA, robotic process automation, which is a very simple technology which has really taken the world that we all work in by storm. But and you could argue with the three main software providers, valued at or certainly two of them in the several billions, that it really has been an effective technology which is of its time. But still, several people said that it promised and should have achieved much more than it has, and it's yet to be really transformational. What's your collective views on RPA being a damp squib?
It's an interesting one. So like a lot of the technologies which have really captures people's imagination and taken off quickly, there's a certain jockeying for position and positioning and repositioning, which is actually unhelpful in the context of the overall market. And that goes for the providers of the technology. It goes for the integration companies who are looking to battle for mind share with customers about who can do the best job of implementation and integration, and the analysts. So everyone's looking to reposition. They're creating a degree of confusion. And I don't think that's really helped the cause of RPA.
That's wise words. I mean, I've been involved personally in about 50 different pilots and implementations of various types of RPA technology in the last 2 years alone. And I think perhaps where the vendors have fallen foul of themselves, they've tried to make it sound too easy. It's not. It's very difficult carving out the sort of benefits these guys and girls are talking about.
Yeah.
If I look across our landscape, our clients, very few of them have implemented thousands of robots. A couple of them have introduced hundreds, majority at the sort of 10 to 100 scale. So I sense that there's a lot of activity and I see pretty significant benefit being delivered. But a lot of the more outrageous claims are a long way off being realised, I think.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic because the software vendors are desperate to sell licenses, of course, and they're going to paint this rosy future of how everything's going to be automated. And relatively naive clients who haven't bought robotic process automation software before are going to be taken in by that. And sometimes, of course, it will be achieved. I'm not being negative for the software sales guys, but quite often it won't unless you're a really, really experienced or capable client.
Well, where I've seen it make the best difference is at that sort of low end benefit scale, modest processes with modest aspects of the workforce associated with them, which historically have been really difficult to attack because they've not been cost effective to come at from a more transformative digital way. Yeah. So just unlocking that kind of thing with a couple of robots has been massively effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a long way to go in the world of RPA and automation generally, of course. So, but let's move on. So the third question we've asked our interviewees so far is a slightly different one. Is there a gadget that they use in their daily lives that's their favourite or being transformational? This is more of a personal question for me because I am a gadget guy. I like to waste money on gadgets which don't add a lot of value to my life typically, although having just got a Peloton, that's now changed. I wouldn't say that's a gadget. It's an essential part of everyday life. I know these two will agree. And there's been some interesting answers on the gadget front as well. But again, first off, let me ask you two, is there a gadget, Mrs. Matthews, that has made a big difference to your life?
So it hasn't made a big difference to my life yet. But with Christmas coming and my birthday around the corner, I'm just going to mention the new AirPods, which I know you have a pair of. And having tried them, there's something about technology that does magic. So Stanton talked about the visual translation that's in Google Translate. And for me, those headphones are magic. You press a button and the world goes and it disappears. It's absolutely magical. They're brilliant.
They are brilliant, and we are giggling because I have a pair, and neither of these two do yet, but I'm feeling they might for Christmas.
But as you say, it's just around the corner. Right? Yes. And one other question: you're not commissioned by True Phones, then you are. More than one brand is available.
Exactly. Right, yes, that's true.
I can relate to that sense of isolation. Definitely, I see the benefit. But the one I feel most strongly about, and actually didn't come up at all in the answers from the guests that you've had so far, was a smartphone. Oh, I love them so much. I've got two. and I'm always reminded of a fantastic picture that was in Newsweek years ago that showed the physical examples of all of the capabilities that are now on the phone, the compass, the watch, the this, the that, you pretty much fill a container with all of the things that are now delivered through your phone. When I think about how much that's changed my life and made it so much easier, it's pretty profound. Yeah. And then you roll that into the business context now. Think of the level of adoption. Ironically, you're talking about smart buds. The accessories for smartphones alone is a 60 billion a year market now. Just buying bits and bobs that go with or add on to a smartphone. That's astonishing. But what really blew me away was I think this year was the first year that globally $700 million of business done on e-commerce through mobile.
Extraordinary. Yeah.
In fact, billion.
Billions, I was going to say, absolutely. That was probably just on over a weekend at Black Friday.
I was going to say my three kids were probably responsible for the vast majority.
Well, when you think about the smartphone, the myriad of uses, and the fact that we can now, sit here and watch a movie on our phones, play music on our phones, record a podcast on our phone, do our email on our phones. It is the single device in your hand, isn't it, that Steve Jobs said it would be all those years ago. And the iPhone is only, 12 years old? It's just incredible. There were some other really interesting answers to the gadget question. I think my favourite was probably Kit Cox from Innate and his Japanese knives. I felt a bit like Kirsty or whoever is now on Desert Island Disc saying, "Are you allowed to have Japanese knives in the gadget category?" But I think you are.
I made a note never to argue with Kit again after hearing that.
Yeah, well, I know if Eleanor's eaten meals that are provided by Kit, and he's quite
an extraordinary cook.
Impressive.
That is for sure.
Yeah, is extraordinary a good thing?
Extraordinary is a very, very good thing. Get an invite if you can, folks.
It's interesting that quite a few people referenced headphones.
Yeah.
There was a real theme, wasn't there, about noise cancelling headphones. Probably because quite a few people that I'd interviewed travel quite a bit, and the fact that you can cancel out the noise and listen to your music or your podcast or your audio books or whatever. And I think that the smaller the headphones, anyway, from my perspective, the better. I know you like your big over the ear things.
If only they could find a technology that stops me leaving them on trains, I'd be
Exactly, yeah. There were a couple of other interesting ones. Somebody said, I can't remember now who it was, one of you will remind me, who said it was their barbecue smoker. I think it was
Alex.
Obviously from the deep south, but his smoker.
Yeah.
I bet it's controlled by his iPhone.
Yeah.
Because all these devices, even if they're real world devices, possibly with the exception of Kit's Japanese knives, are all controllable by smartphone these days. That's what's so brilliant.
I know Nicola will be listening, so just getting my Christmas bin in now. A good friend of mine's inherited the latest Weber barbecue, and that's all controlled from a smartphone now.
There you go.
Well, it's available now.
John Harrod, who runs our network team, and we talked about in episode 6, we talked about network sourcing and 5G. He came up with a term that I'd actually never heard of. I was ashamed to say a NAS, a network attached storage device, which he has around his house, which enables him to stream movies, listen to music in the car from anywhere and everywhere. And so I think I'd like one of those. So that was a really interesting answer. So let's move on to a more serious one, if you like, back into the business world. The fourth question, my penultimate question, has been, is there a technology that you think is going to have a big impact on business over the next decade, or which technology will have the most transformational impact on business over the next decade? Some interesting answers here, but again, first off, let me ask you both. So Eleanor, let me come to you first. Which technology do you think will be transformational over the next 10 years?
So I know it's controversial given the overhyped being answered with this a couple of times, but for me, it is DLT, so distributed ledger technology, not blockchain necessarily, not completely democratized open networks, but distributed ledgers will absolutely transform the cost base of supply chains and will unlock so much speed within the supply chain that it will change everything, in my opinion. And if you look at some of the new protocols that are coming out, which allow for Internet of Things to be super easily integrated. So those two technologies in combination, transformational. And with 5G coming up behind, which enables the IoT proliferation, that would definitely be my answer.
Yeah, good one.
Yeah, it's difficult to argue with that, but I think I'm more with the audience actually that you've seen so far. There was a bit of a hung parliament between 5G and AI. I'm definitely in the AI camp. I mean, I agree. I can see the DLT changing the nature of transactions and changing the nature of relationships. Definitely. What AI and ML is doing is transforming what relationships are. It's helping us discover new markets and new sense of purpose at one end of the scale. I thought what was interesting though was that although everybody agreed it was going to be fundamental, there wasn't any alignment about what the vision is for where AI and ML are going to take us. You've got Kit on the one hand talking about this dystopian vision of a desert, scorched earth run by computers. And then on the other end of the scale, maybe there's a chance that a bank could actually offer me something that's relevant for a change. Somewhere between those two will lie the truth, I'm sure.
Yeah, and one of my guests, and I can't remember exactly who mentioned this, but I remember thinking about it afterwards and think I must do some more research on this, it was the democratization of cryptocurrency. So enabling a Facebook or an Amazon effectively to have their own currency and control what you spend with them and how would be game-changing to society. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting point. And intellectually, I can absolutely see that would be really important. And I know Facebook came out with their own currency not that long ago. But if organizations, big global organizations start to be able to control their own currency in that way at a large scale, I can see that to be game-changing.
I think it would be very ironic, actually, if those big, new, untrusted institutions do establish themselves as the new owners of that kind of trusted currency. I think that's not where we wanted all of this to go.
No.
However, maybe the upside is when we look at the amount of unbanked and the uninsured around the world, perhaps that technology will allow us to bring them. And then
that's the message that they will tout, of course.
Yeah.
And so,
powered by Facebook, not so much.
The sad thing is that actually, if you look at those unbanked and their first experiences of cryptocurrency have been with the biggest scam in the world. So that must have left a sour taste in the mouth of a lot of people.
Which scam are you talking about?
I'm talking about OneCoin.
Yeah.
Well, just explain OneCoin to our listeners who might not be familiar.
So OneCoin is purported to be a cryptocurrency. It was launched a number of years ago and it's sold as educational packages to the masses who have invested 15 billion euros since it's been in existence. And there is not an underlying blockchain, it is asserted. And so therefore it cannot be a cryptocurrency. So the person that launched this initiative has now disappeared and is not traceable. Her brother, who took over when she disappeared, is in prison. So, and all of these people in countries which did not have a secure banking system and trusted this as a trustless system have been left with educational packages, and that's it.
There's a really good podcast. I think it's done by the BBC actually. I think it's called The Missing Crypto Queen or something similar. Really worth a listen. And as you say, it's purported that OneCoin has been part of a pyramid marketing scheme, which has lost a lot of people a lot of a lot of money. So, interesting. Very, very good point. So the sort of themes we saw in that question about technology over the next 10 years were really blockchain and distributed ledger technology, lots of AI and machine learning, a couple of 5G technology, and I thought probably the wisest of my guests, and an incredibly wise man, Professor Leslie Wilcox, who, and I can't remember how many books he'd written, but it was an awful lot, more than I'd read. And he said, well, the thing which will be game changing is the convergence of all of these technologies, which of course is, I think we would all agree, is absolutely correct. It's the orchestration and stitching together of blockchain with AI and 5G. You get all of that together and big data, and suddenly you've got a really intelligent enterprise that can make dynamic decisions using the meaningful insight from the data it collects. So let's move on, however, to our final question. The last question, again, which is a mixture of the sort of personal and business, but is there somebody who's had a big impact on your career to date? And I've referred to them with my guests as, who's your technology hero? And again, it could be somebody who's had a personal impact, and a lot of the guests chose people from their family or from their early careers, or it could be someone who a figure from industry on the global stage that inspired you. And there were some interesting responses to that question. So let me turn that final question to you both. And Bryn, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, for sure. I think reflecting on the answers that you've had so far, there's an interesting split. There's a sort of dichotomy between the Turings of the world and the Teslas of the world, who are creating really foundational technology. And then you had the Jobs and the Ives of this world who've really commercialised that, put a design spin on it, and changed the way we think about using technology in our personal lives. So that's an interesting split. But the one missing name, and the one that I'd add to it, is Berners-Lee. Going back to my point about the internet at the start of all of this, and perhaps reflecting your point around convergence, what he did and what he created and what he set in force, I think we're all going to be enjoying for a lot longer.
And what about you, Mrs. Matthews?
So for me, I studied computing science a million years ago at university, and I remember while I was struggling in my labs to make my Pascal code compile and do what it was supposed to do, I'm thinking, why am I studying this subject? I read a book about Steve Jobs, which was called Insanely Great. And what I took from that book was that this was a person who got technology, that's a given, and had a brilliant technical vision. However, what he had was balls. He took a small group within his company, he stuck a pirate's flag on the roof, and he said, "Follow me, chaps. This is going to be insanely great."
Yeah.
And that just appeals to my sense of adventure.
Yeah.
And I thought, yes, I want to do that.
Absolutely great.
I like the mixture in some of the responses, with some people having, personal, just people who've spent a little bit of time with them when they were, in the beginnings of their career, and who had such a big impact, almost like a teacher can when you're at school, or someone who was in charge of the certain division or team you were in at your first job, or someone who was your chief exec. We've had quite a few of those from the chief exec from American Express, who then went on to IBM, or from GE, and Kit Burden with his, the partner that inspired him, Mr. Cunningham. And then, of course, as you said, the Steve Jobs, the Johnny Ive, the Alan Turing, the Tim Berners-Lee, etc. So a real mixture.
And still some massive names not on the list. Nobody mentioned Bill Gates, which really surprised me. He seems to be having a bit of resurgence in the personal media front at the moment. And the other Mr. Tesla.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or Guido guy, definitely, again, reflecting your sort of slightly maverick view, but, what he did in terms of before the car, changing the way we transact and putting a different way of spending money was profound.
Yeah.
So, a lot of interesting names still to
Yeah. But I think the one of the things I took away from that question, and I really like that question, is you don't have to be a leader of a global business to have an impact on people's career. Just by doing what we do and trying to inspire the people who work for us every day, you can have a fundamental impact on what they do and how they think and how they see and use technology to transform business, which is what this podcast has been all about. So I want to say A huge thank you, of course, to Eleanor and Bryn for joining me on the final podcast of 2019, our 10th episode. So big thank you to you guys. I want to thank all of the guests who've joined me over the past 9 episodes, all 16 of them. So thank you ever so much. We've had really, really interesting conversations. I've really enjoyed it. A big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to this podcast. We have a few thousand regular listeners, which is just great. We've had some great reviews. So please continue to review. Give us your feedback. If there's something you'd like us to cover, please let us know. And now as we sit here in December and think about Christmas, and we're about to go for our Christmas party this afternoon, which will be fun, and we turn our thoughts to 2020, this podcast experiment, if you like, has been a real success for us at ISG Smartalks. We've really enjoyed it. And we're going to be expanding it and changing it a little bit in 2020. We're going to have the next series starting in January, still ISG Smartalks, interviewing leaders in this new digital world in the same way that we have, but with more of a focus on what it takes to be a leader of people and divisions and of technology in an increasingly digital world. Do the skills that worked in an older pre-digital organizations in the world of the CIO and the CTO, are they still as applicable in the new digital realm that we work in now, which is potentially more the era of the chief digital officer or the chief security officer or the chief automation officer? So we have some fantastic guests coming in who are CDOs and CIOs and CSOs who've got real strong views on this, and we're going to kick off the series in January. So watch this space for more podcasts from ISG Smartalks. So thank you to our listeners. Thank you to our guests. Happy Christmas and a happy New Year, and we will see you in January.